I'm going to show you how to group rows in AG grid. So I have a plain grid ready with some columns and some rows loaded. To enable grouping, I add the row group flag to the column I want to group by. So if I want to group by country, I simply add row group as true on the country column. Now, as you can see, the grid is grouping by the country and has created an extra column for the group. This is called the auto group column, which is generated by the grid and is just like any other column. If I want to also group on the year, I add the row group flag onto the year column. As you can see, if I expand on a group, I can see that the years are also now grouped. Note that I'm able to make the auto group column sortable by adding sortable on the default code diff in the grid options. This sorting applies to all columns in the grid, including the auto group column, because it's just like a normal column. I'm going to show you how to group rows so that each group is in its own column, as opposed to having many groups showing in one column. Let's see this in action. Here you can see how the auto group column combines the country and the year groups together. This is the AG grid default behavior that we saw in the previous example. To enable multi-auto group columns, you just have to add the property group multi-auto column as true in the grid options. Now you can see that we have two columns instead of one that shows the groupings. AG grid will create one column per column that you want to group by. Note that since we are specifying country and year to be grouped, now we have these columns appear twice in the grid. One pair has been created for the grid, and these are now each used for the row grouping. The other pair is the one that we have provided in the coldefs. Let's hide the coldefs columns since they are now redundant. To do so, we just have to add the property hide on the column, and the view will be more streamlined. Now they're hidden. Note also that we're using default coldef to sort, because the multi-auto group columns are just like normal columns. So now we can sort on these columns. Now that we've looked at how to group rows in the grid, let's look at how to customize the auto group columns. In this example, I'm going to show you a few configurations that you can do. To begin with, we need to provide the property auto group column depth to the grid options. To change the header name of the column, I simply add the field header name and set it to a string, for example, custom. The auto group columns generated by the grid use the AG grid provided group cell renderer. The benefit to this means that I can pass additional properties to further customize how the groups are displayed. I can remove the count for each group shown in the brackets by adding the cell render params inside that and add suppress count as true. Now you can see the count is no longer showing on the groups. I can also add a checkbox to each group by adding checkbox as true. And now we can see there are checkboxes appearing on each group. You may have noticed in the example so far that the group columns don't produce values in the leaf nodes. So if I expand on the row group China, I can see that the leaf nodes are empty. If you want to add values to these cells, then you can add a field or a value getter to the auto group column def, and this will render the leaf node. So I'm going to add the field athlete to these cells. Now if I expand on China again, I can see that the athletes are added. A side effect of providing a field to the auto group column def is that filtering now works on the column. But this is providing that you have also added the filter as true in the default codef. To filter, I select the column menu and then select the filter menu tab. And then I can see that the values that have been filtered are the athlete. Note that the filter will work if you specify a field, a value getter, or a filter value getter. If you are displaying more than one group in a column, the grid will order the groups based in the order in which you provided the columns. So in this example, I can see that the country is going to be grouped first because it's listed first, and the year will be grouped second. But to change this, you can use the property row group index to explicitly set the order of the grouping. So if I wanted to group by year first, I can set the row group index to 0. And to group country second, I can set the row group index to 1. Now if I look on the grid, I can see that year is grouped first, and if I expand, I can see that country is grouped second. Note that the values can be any numbers that are sortable. They don't have to start at 0 or 1, and the sequence can have gaps. We're going to look at hide open parents. The easiest way to show this feature is by comparing it with the grid that uses it and with one that doesn't. This grid is simply showing the groups as by default, and you can see that when you expand a group. As you would expect, the row that has the group stays there. To enable hide open parents, I set the property group hide open parents to true in the grid options. The first thing to notice is that the grid has immediately reverted to multi-auto column group. This is because it is the only way this feature makes sense. You can see this because if you compare it with the other example, now we have a country and a year column for the groups, and before we only had one group column. Now if I expand a group, you will see the difference. Note that with hide open parents, the expanded node immediately embeds the next group. If we didn't have this feature enabled, the grid would have created 2 row groups, one for the country and one for the year, but now it's creating one that's combining both. This feature is helpful if you're looking to have a different feel to your grouping. By default, when dragging a column out of the grid will make it hidden. To show this, I have a grid ready with the row group panel at the top, which lets you group by column when dragged to the panel. So to see this in action, if I drag the country column to the row group panel, I can see now the grid is grouping by the country, and also note that the country column is now not visible. This is the default behavior of the grid, and it's more natural for most scenarios as it stops the data appearing twice. But if you want to keep the country column showing whilst grouped, I can add the property suppress drag leave hides columns to the grid options. So now if I group by country again, we can see that the country column is now showing, and it's also being grouped. Another property that you could also use is suppress make column visible after ungroup. This property lets you not show the column after ungrouping. So the default behavior currently is when I group by a column and then ungroup, the column is showing. However, if I use this property and I group by a column and now I ungroup, you can see that the column is now not visible.
In this video, I will show you how you can use full width group rows. You can use them when you want to display more information about the group. Full width group rows don't use a column for displaying its content. Instead, it takes up the full width of the row. Notice in this example, I'm grouping by country. And we have our automatically generated column with the name group in here. Now if I set the group use entire row property to true, notice that the automatically generated column is now gone from the grid, and the group row is spanning across all columns. Now we have all this extra space for the row groups. We can use this space by providing a custom group row renderer. This would allow you to take full control on how you want to render the row groups. However, this would mean that you would have to implement the collapse and expand functionality. Luckily, the grid has a default group row renderer, which allows you to provide an inner renderer component such that you don't need to worry about the expand collapse functionality. Here in this example, I have an inner renderer component. I have provided this to the grid, and I'm also passing some parameters which the component uses internally. In this case, they are country flag codes. Now if I uncomment this, now as you can see, we have used the full width of the row to display extra information about the group.
By default, the grid does not attempt to order the groups. The groups are presented on a first come, first served basis based on the row data, As you can see here, we're grouping by the country, and if you notice here, the groups are not ordered. If you wanted to order this column, for most scenarios this is not an issue because you could just sort on the grouping column. One way of applying the sort is by adding the sortable property to the default codef. Now I'm able to sort on the grouping column. However, this isn't possible in some cases. For example, if I'm using full width group rows. This is because there is no columns associated with the groups to order them. So if we have a closer look at this, and I enable full width group rows by adding the property group use entire row in the grid options. Now we can see that the full width group rows are enabled, but there is no columns associated for the groups. To provide a group order, you can supply the default group sort comparator callback to the grid. The callback is a standard JavaScript array comparator that takes two values and compares them. So in this example, the default group sort comparator simply groups the groups in alphabetical order. And now I can see that the groups are ordered. Now we're going to look at unbalanced groups. This is when the column that is being grouped contains rows which have null or undefined values for that column. So for example, you can see here in my row data, the first 6 rows have the value null for the state column, and also we're grouping by the state column. As you can see here in the grid, the auto group column contains rows and also groups. This is what we refer to as unbalanced groups. If you want these rows to not be left out of a group, but want a group to contain these rows, there's a couple of ways of doing this. One way would be to change your data and replace the null with something else. For example, a blank string. Now you can see I contained all the rows in a group.
In this example, I will show you how to expand a group node, but using the API instead. So here I have a function which is listening on this button click event, and it's going to be run every time you click the button. So here I'm using Grid Options API for each node, and basically what this does is loops over all the nodes and invokes a function callback, which passes in the node as a parameter. So what you can do here is write an if statement and check if node key is Zimbabwe, then simply call the node API setExpanded method and pass in the boolean true. And now if I refresh the page, this should expand Zimbabwe. In this video, I will show you how to use the key creator for grouping complex objects. The key creator is a callback where you can specify the key to use for grouping on a row-by-row basis. It is useful in many cases, but in this example, we are going to be using the key creator to group data that is represented as a complex object as opposed to simple data. In this example, note how we are grouping by the country field. And also note that the field value which we are grouping by is a complex object. And lastly, see how the grid cannot figure out what key to use for grouping, and it prints out object. So now let's change this to group by country name. And before showing you the code, let's first explain how the key creator works. The key creator would be invoked once per row and is meant to return a string that the grid will use in order to group by for that column. It also is important to note that the key creator callback receives a value property that matches the original value, the row data. In this case, it's the complex object. And now that we know the theory, let's see how it can help in our case. Since we want to group by the country name, I have created a key creator, which I will uncomment, that receives the country object in its parameters and returns its property name, achieving what we are looking for, which is to group by country name. As you can see, UK, Spain, and France. In this video, I will show you how to use grouping footers. To include a footer within each row group, you can set the group include footer property to true in your grid options. Now, for example, if I expand Zimbabwe, you can see that there is a footer displayed at the bottom of the group, and this footer is only visible when the group is expanded. Also, you might already notice two things. First is that when expanding the row group, the aggregations are jumping from the header to the footer. Also, you might notice that there's a total prefix, and this is the default prefix. We can change this using something called a footer value getter, which we can define in our cell renderer params. So now if I uncomment this, and I expand Zimbabwe again, notice that there's a new prefix called footer Zimbabwe, and this is true for all groups. There is also an option to include the grand total footer that works across all groups, and it is displayed at the bottom of the grid. This option is called group include total footer, and you can enable it in your grid options by setting it to true. Now if I scroll down to the bottom of the grid, you can see that there is a footer that holds the grand total across all groups. We will look at two grid properties: group remove single children and group remove lowest single children. First, let's take a look at group remove single children property. If you enable this property, the grid will find all the group nodes, and if the group node has only one child, it will be removed from the grid. For example, notice Ireland has only one child, which is Dublin. So we expect Ireland to be removed from the grid. Dublin has 3 children, so Dublin should stay. Pakistan has only one child, so Pakistan should be removed. And Ardabil has only one child, so Ardabil should be removed. So if we set the property, as you can see, Ireland has been removed, and also the Pakistan and Ardabil has been removed. Now let's take a look at group remove lowest single children property. So the difference here is that this time only the lowest level group nodes with single children will get removed. In our example, the lowest level group is the city group, so only the city group with single children will get removed. Here we have Dublin, our first city, and this will not get removed because it has 3 children. So we can expect Ardabil to be removed, Delhi to be removed, and so forth. And as you can see, all the cities with only one child has been removed. So we only have Dublin, and that's it. In this video, I will show you how to create your own custom group display columns. Usually you don't need to create your own group display columns, as the grid generates a group column automatically. It's called an auto group column. In our example, notice that we have enabled row group on the country column definition. And by default, the grid has automatically generated a column for us. To suppress this behavior, we can set the group suppress auto column to true in our grid options. So if I do this, notice that the grid is rendering the group nodes, but because there isn't a column to render the row groups, the grid appears to be blank. So now to create a custom group display column, first we need to create a new column definition. So now notice that I have created a new column. Second, we need to configure this column such that the grid knows which row groups it needs to show. And this is done by setting the show row group property. If you want to show the grouping for a particular column, you can set the show row group to the column's ID. For example, if I set this to country, notice that the grid is now rendering all the country groups. However, it is missing some functionality. like expand and collapse. To work around this, we can provide a group cell renderer for our custom column. We have two options. We can create our own custom group cell renderer, which would encapsulate the expand collapse behavior, or we can use the default AG grids component. In our example, we will use the AG group cell renderer, which is also used by the auto group column. So if I set this, now notice that we have expand collapse icon and account, and I can expand and collapse these row groups. And this is done by the AG group cell renderer. We can also make this column display more than one grouping. We simply need to change the show row group property to true. Now if I set the row group for the year column definition, notice that we have two groupings. We have the country followed by the year. You can change the order by simply swapping the column definitions. Now notice that they are in reverse order, year followed by country.